All right, so the term threshold usually applies in the modern day to um, yung parang elevated part dun sa ilalim ng pinto. The original context was yung sa threshing floor. So it's a partition, of course, that separates the inside from the outside. Sabi ng iba, ito ay para hindi, basta na lang mag-roll over yung threshed agricultural produce from the inside to the outside, kaya may elevation yun. Pero ngayon, it's usually just yung ilalim ng pinto mo na sometimes may elevated part. No? Sa Pilipinas, meron yan para to keep away yung baha for flood-prone areas. So anyway, of course, when we say threshold test, ASTM defines this as concentration range below which the taste or odor of the substance will not be practically detectable by the panelist, okay? And above which the normal sense of smell or taste would readily detect the substance. So maraming kinds of sensory thresholds, pero essentially yun nga, para siyang pinto, it separates the, in this case, not the inside from the outside, but rather the being able to detect at a certain concentration and not being able to detect. So para siyang boundary concentration. Okay, we'll look at this in the next few slides. Okay, so absolute or detection threshold separates the presence from the absence of something. In this case, sensory, no? So whether it's a taste or aroma or yeah, sound. So parang, excuse me, may lasa versus walang lasa. May naririnig ako versus wala akong marinig. So in decibels. And may naamoy ako versus wala akong naamoy. It doesn't necessarily mean that you can identify what kind of, let's say, may taste. Okay, hindi siya tubig lang pero hindi mo alam kung matamis siya or maalat siya. Basta alam mo hindi siya tubig. So that would have to deal with the absolute detection threshold. You can detect, but you cannot identify specifically anong klase siya. Okay? So recognition threshold on the other hand, ito naman yung yes na detect mo siya and then at the same time, kaya mo siyang ma-recognize or mapangalanan na, uy, hindi siya tubig, matamis siya. O hindi siya tubig lang, maalat siya. May naamoy ako, oh, I know this aroma, it's peanut butter, or something like that. So definitely, madalas higher than the absolute threshold yung concentration needed mo or yung amplitude if it's sound para ano siya, ma-recognize mo siya, no? So, usually useful yung mga ganitong iba't ibang thresholds to test the sensory acuity of people, especially for panelist training as a form of screening, for example. Kasi syempre, mas gusto mo yung mga taong mas mataas, mas mababa yung threshold for their ability to taste and smell things that other people would not even detect. Kapag sinabi naman natin na difference threshold, so this would involve, for example, two different concentrations of the same substance, like let's say sugar in water. The difference threshold is kaya mo nang i-differentiate, for example, which among the two sugar concentrations is sweeter. No, kasi for example, if it's a 1 and a 1.5% sugar solution, you may not be able to tell which is sweeter, no? So, kasi masyadong maliit yung difference niya. So, the difference threshold then would be useful for, well, of course, yung mga panelists for difference test, lalo na kung sa part of training, diba? Gusto mong hasain yung ability nila to detect smaller differences, especially if you're in quality control, for example. Minor nuances or changes in the aroma of sample that's stored over time for shelf life, halimbawa. So, you need to get that mataas yung ability mo to differentiate between samples na maliit yung actual differences. So, pag sinabi mo namang terminal threshold, dito naman yung cutoff, let's say, concentration in a solution, wherein an increase would no longer produce an increase in perceived intensity. Halimbawa, sa sugar, wala nang itatamis pa kahit dagdagan mo yan ng asukal, manhid na yung receptors ng dila mo to send a signal to your brain that's saying that this is sweeter than the previous one. Okay? So, of course, as you can see from now, these different thresholds have different uses, and you can off the bat think about them yourselves then, no? So, next we look at their relevance and how threshold tests are done. So, a caveat, of course, here, since we're dealing with human responses, mahirap iset yung threshold levels ng isang tao to a fixed point, okay? So, variability can come from the point at which observers change their response, especially from multiple individuals. Kasi usually you present multiple concentrations and you measure, collect data from there and try to determine the various thresholds of individuals and groups. Of course, within a single individual, it may vary. Pwedeng yung condition mo for that day, yung panlasa mo, yung all of the other things that could give you a sensory evaluation bias, no? Which we've studied before. Even within the same experimental session, yung pagsukat ng thresholds ng mga tao may vary, and of course, within different people, mag-iiba talaga. So in short, hindi rin madaling sabihin nga, even for the same person, na ito yung threshold mo. So, there are ways of measuring, but again, pwede rin namang through time maging mas mahasa yung ability mo or magdull yung senses mo through aging and other factors like hormonal, etc. So, one of the most common methods is 3AFC or 3 ascending force choice. From the name itself, there are 3 samples, 2 of which are blank and 1 of which is of a certain concentration greater than 0. And these are presented to the panelists in ascending concentration. So lowest concentration first and so on. And then parang ang lalabas niyan is triangle test. Pipiliin mo alin doon sa tatlo yung merong hindi blank, okay? So of course in this case we can see you start with dabbling with what concentrations to use, and then you set up the concentration ranges, assemble your test panel, conduct your AFC test, and then measure your thresholds using the geometric mean. Okay, so we'll look at sample number crunching in the next few slides. By the way, there's a different method of calculation for individuals and for groups. So in the first case, you get the geometric mean of the last incorrect and the first correct concentration. And you also consider the lowest correct concentration. And then if it's a panel or a group, you get the geometric mean of the individual thresholds. So, bakit mo ba kailangan ng individual and group thresholds, di ba? Kasi, of course, if you're obvious naman yun sa individual kasi you want to profile yung mga tao mo. Halimbawa, kung meron dong super duper galing or kung merong lagging behind. But usually, when you present samples, iisa lang naman yung set of samples mo for a group. So, as a rule of thumb, you may want a group threshold, okay, na inaging basis mo for whatever sensory tests you plan to conduct. Basis mo siya for the concentrations that you'll be using. Of course, there are a lot of resources on these. even yung mga ano ba yung typical ranges ng thresholds for the average individual. So say for example in this case there are 11 concentrations, okay. Then you can see here from 0 all the way to 0.62. Usually ano to, no, weight over volume, mass fraction. So very small, mga less than 1%. And then you would give them. So pag 0, ibig sabihin ito ay nagkamali sila. Pag plus, ito yung tumama sila. So usually kapag natama mo yung low, yung first concentration na matama mo, after nun matatama mo na yung lahat. So parang malabong maging fluke yun. Okay. So for example in this data, as you can see, subject 1 tumama siya sa third concentration, subject 2 sa second concentration, subject 3 sa 8th, and subject 25 sa third. Okay, so you'll do some calculations on these. Okay, so for example in this case, looking at subject 3, the concentrations where nakuha niya yung first and second na tama niya is 0.08 and 0.16. So to get the geometric mean of that, you just multiply this two and get the square root of their product. That will be equal to this one. Then if you get the log of this value, you'll get this minus 0.946, and you get the mean of all the logarithmic values, and then you get the antilog of that to get the group threshold concentration. So ito naman, to ascending force choice, 5 replicates, meaning to say dalawa lang, isang blank tsaka isang may concentration. Tapos meron kang 5 replicates, meaning to say uulitin mo yung test na yun 5 times. And the threshold is determined as the lowest concentration wherein nakuha mo 5 times na tama. Tapos dapat yung kasunod na concentration 5 times mo rin na tama. Okay? So if for example out of 5 replicates, 4 times ka lang tumama, hindi pa yun. Okay? So we've discussed charm analysis previously. Again, it's the use of gas chromatography with a sniffing port to churn out one by one yung mga odorant compounds mo na hiniwalay, molecularly speaking, from the whole. And then what they do here now is they measure threshold by running descending concentrations of the runs, tapos dun sa part na wala ka nang maamoy, yun yung pag-determine ng threshold. So in sensory evaluation, time is equally a factor to be considered, no? Since may products na hindi immediate yung peak nung pag-detect ng kanilang intensity. For example, kung may maanghang na pagkain, merong iba dyan, nalunok mo na, tsaka mo lang naramdaman yung burn sa throat mo. Merong iba naman na parang delayed yung magiging response ng dila mo. Okay. And dyan din yung pagsukat ng aftertaste and the lingering tastes na maybe seconds or longer after you've consumed the product. So meron ka pang mararamdaman na sensation na wala naman nung minunguya mo yung product mismo or something. Okay, so these can be quantified and measured through the time intensity methods. Of course, in this case, given na very important yung kailan mo susukatin yung parameter of interest mo, pati yung pagsunod ng mga panelists dun sa method mo to the dot dun sa oras na kailangan. So in time intensity methods, you could obtain information on the maximum intensity of a given sensory attribute, such as taste, aroma, or halimbawa yung anghang or something, how long it takes for that maximum intensity to be perceived, and then parang isusukatin mo gaano katagal bago bumaba yung intensity na yon to a certain point, like maybe halfway through. So this may require training for ratio data in that case, and the total duration of the sensation. So there are many approaches to time intensity methods. The first is to simply ask the panelists to rate the intensity over time during the different phases of the consuming the food. On the other hand, while this recognizes the dynamic consumption related changes, it does not attempt to track any detailed changes across continuous time spans or with the fine division. So, um, of course, that will be its limitation. But at least makikita mo kailan ba more or less dun sa point ng consumption ng food nararamdaman yung mga bagay, like when it touches your lips, when it touches your tongue, in the middle of chewing, or after swallowing, or what amount of time after. So the second approach focuses on discrete time interval. So imbis na makafocus ka dun sa different phases of consumption, nakafocus ka per se dun sa oras. Okay? And because of this, it allows you to, well, if you're measuring the same amount of time that passes by, it allows you to track changes on intensity of flavor and or texture attributes, as well as allow you to take on multiple attributes for each time interval. No? So, pwedeng sabay-sabay mong ine-examine yung texture niya, yung flavor. Of course, medyo mahirap yun sa panel, so you need some kind of training for that. So in this third approach, you use a human interface device such as a stick or a knob or lever to track the changes in flavor or texture during the duration of the testing. No? So, and then nakalink ito dun sa oras. So perhaps being recorded at the same time with the changes in the intensity so that you can get data that tells you the intensity changes at a specific time frame, usually used in flavor or texture related time intensity measurements. So ano bang gamit nitong time intensity methods? Of course, you can use it to track flavor sensations over time, changes in texture and phase, especially during mastication, or if the product itself is sensitive to maybe body temperature or other things, no? Taste and odor adaptation. So merong mga sa tao din, parang minsan nasa perception naman yung intensity responses nila, di ba? Na pag nag-adapt ka na, then mapapansin mo yan as parang nagpipik. Nasasanay na yung bunganga mo dun sa kakaibang intensity na maybe sa unang dampi sa bibig mo, malakas siya, and then dahil nasasanay ka na, okay na afterwards. Flavor release, of course, in the flavor industry, they have these base note, top note, end note, in terms na ginagamit nila na parang pag sinubo mo yung isang bagay, may una kang malalasahan, then merong huli, tapos meron sa gitna lang, okay? So you could quantify the time in between those releases and quantify the changes in intensity. For example, kasi minsan hindi agad nag-a-appear or na-perceive yung mga flavors na yun. Alright, so yung mga super tasters probably dyan magaling. And okay, the time-related aspects of liking. So, maari mo ring malaman siguro, since this is hedonics, then for consumers, ano ba yung saan ba yung pinakamalakas na sensation or pinakamataas na liking during the consumption of food. Maybe it's the first bite or yung level ng flavor release foods, na pag mga crispy food, syempre hinahanap mo yung sa first bite yung lutong niya, di ba? Or pag dumampi sa dila mo yung let's say potato chip, tapos lahat ng cheese powder na-absorb na ng dila mo at nag-send na ng signal sa brain mo, yun ba yung hinahanap mong moment or something like that. So let's try to summarize this SEM. As you can see here, depending on the context or the objective, malalaman natin based on this simple table what test to use. So for example, if the question is how do I know what kind of product I should make, this is usually a product development challenge, and it usually requires a plethora of different tests to use, no? Kasi sa different stages ng product dev, you may want to look at the consumer testing, or if you're looking at quality control of the process product, then you might want to do difference tests and so on. What about when you want to do a product matching? So, kung gusto mo yung gayahin exactly, very closely yung mga patok sa market ngayon, halimbawa yung lasa ng milk tea na binibili nila madalas hanggang sa masabi ng consumer na, uy, pwede na tong pamalit dun sa mas expensive na milk tea na binibili ko kasi hindi ko naman ano yung difference sa lasa. So of course, you use either difference or similarity, difference tests, focusing on the similarity testing. As we can remember, whether you're testing for difference or similarity as your objective would affect your target alpha and beta, no? So this is again a case of product matching challenge wherein ang objective mo naman is, although you're doing a difference test, gusto mo na yung maging accepted na hypothesis is that no difference exists, or rather na hindi ma-reject yung null hypothesis na walang difference yung products. Okay. Next, if you want to determine the direction in which you need to move your product, you might want to look at difference and effective tests. So, parang halimbawa, meron kang product na nasa market, tapos parang may igaganda pa to. So, you first need to define what sensory characteristic needs improvement. And then look at difference tests would tell you that the product itself has changed from the original, although regarding if it's a change for the better or the worse, only effective tests can tell you that. But of course, you have to look at market data as well, yung qualitative comments ng mga tao, okay? Kung halimbawa, ano ba yung ayaw niya sa product na ito na maaaring ma-improve, no? Like for example, Lucky Me's thinner noodles per se. You know that you need a difference test addressing the diameter of the noodles for them to be perceptibly thinner than the old ones. But at the same time, it is market data that would tell you that you'd want it thinner and not thicker or of a different shape, like say triangular cross-sectional shape, no, or something. Okay, next problem. My company changes the manufacturing process. How do I know if this will affect my product? Sa mga kasong ganito, halimbawa, no, merong planta na dilapidated na yung equipment. You bought new equipment na maybe same brand, newer model, or na-bankrupt na yung dating company na pinagbibilan nyo, different brand, similar equipment. Usually, this does change the sensory properties of the product somehow, no? Like for example, sa ice cream, yung machine na nag-fill ng ice cream cones, yung naglalagay ng chocolate sauce dun sa loob, tapos may toppings and all. So, yung mga ganon, no? May mga machine-specific quirks yung mga yan. So, you start with the process change, confirm that no difference exists between samples from the old equipment and the new equipment, halimbawa. And then, if the difference does exist, pwede mong i-analyze yan sa lab and confirm it through consumer reviews. Kasi pwede namang for the better yung change. Kung gusto nilang i-retain, then you have to work your way around it para ma-retain siya. So this, of course, involves similarity testing and possibly effective tests. Or maybe even So affective meaning pwedeng hedonic, pwedeng preference, and so on. What about substitution? So let's say you want a lower cost ingredient to substitute the expensive one. You want to look at product changes. So usually difference testing din yun. Usually for similarity, kung hindi mo naman goal ang new in-improve pero status quo lang, ayaw mo lang na ano siya, na ma-perceive ng mga tao na nagpalit ka ng cocoa powder na half the price ng premium na ginagamit mo. Okay, or nagbawas ka ng 5% by weight na cocoa powders. Gusto mo malaman kung mapapansin ba nilang binawasan ko to. Okay? Caveat lang dun, no? If you do that over time, paulit-ulit, then the product now would be different definitely from the product years ago, even if incrementally binawasan mo siya to the point na hindi napansin ng consumers kada increment, no? So caution lang doon, it will dilute quality of your product over time if you abuse that approach. Okay, so again, if no difference exists, if a difference does exist, you want to know, is it a positive or negative thing? Kasi minor differences in the product na napaperceive, hindi naman always detrimental yan. Kung may difference nga na noticeable sa difference testing, pero hindi naman nagbago yung acceptance niya or tumaas pa, edi baka welcome yon na bagay na change sa product niyo. Next, ensuring the quality of products maintained during all stages of production. Okay, so quality control issue to. During the stage of production hanggang makarating sa consumer, lalo na for very sensitive, temperature sensitive products, no, sasakayan sa truck, minsan sa barko, sa eroplano, lalagay sa warehouse, ililipat ng kung frozen product yan, nakailang transfer sa freezer, frozen truck freezer, temperature abuse, and so on. Okay, so definitely you would want descriptive tests on top of difference tests. Different tests would tell you, is the sample different from the other batches or after undergoing transport from Quezon City to Bicol or to Mindanao. Okay, parang does the transport process degrade the product significantly? Nasa ice cream kasi talagang important yung temperature control, for example. And then descriptive test using a train panel can really make nuances as to ano yung nagbago, yung volume ba ng ice cream, bumagsak siya. Of course, may physico-chemical test din to measure that. Naging mas icy ba siya kasi yung pag-fluctuate ng temperature nag-cause ng nucleation ng larger ice crystals and it affects the texture. Kaya pala, mas mababa yung acceptance ng ice cream natin from Visayas and Mindanao versus Southern Luzon or immediate Northern Luzon. Kasi yung planta mo nasa Central Luzon or sa Southern Luzon lang, and so on. Okay, not to be overly repetitive, but just to drill into us yung mga pinag-aralan natin. If, for example, the question is the existence of a sensory difference between samples or the established presence of a similarity such that samples can be used interchangeably, ano ba yung mga possible applications sila? So, pwede itong gamitin sa ingredient processing, package changes, or changes during storage, sa determination ng overall difference without any specific attribute, kung hindi mo alam kung ano per se maapektuhan, determining samples sufficiently similar for interchangeable use. Pwedeng ito yung ingredients per se na interchange mo si brand A at si brand B. Okay. And for example, for the training of panelists, yung galing nila mag-discriminate between very minute changes in the samples can be used as screening criteria. So although we might think that medyo interchangeable itong mga difference test natin, they may have certain uses na mas okay yung one over the other. For example, for triangle tests, definitely the two samples would not be visibly different. Because if it's a giveaway, nag-test ka pa. Visual kasi yung pinakamadaling ma-recognize unless colorblind yung panelist mo, very small population naman ng colorblind, no? It's statistically efficient but is more prone to sensory fatigue. So you don't want to use this kapag maraming replicates. And you can use a smaller set of subjects, but requires all of these, of course, require brief training. Sa Duo Trio, of course, visible differences should also not be present. Low statistical efficiency, but less fatigue because you're comparing two at a time rather than three simultaneously. Okay? So, maybe for more replicates, well, you will need more replicates din kasi mababa yung statistical efficiency niya. Downside would be the use of more subjects compared to triangle test. Same difference test on the other hand, similar to Duo Trio in most cases, but better for samples with lingering flavors. Okay, and as you can see here, there are other samples na medyo complex na pwedeng gamitin ito. Okay. Similar to Duo Trio din lang since pareho sila ng statistical efficiency, yung number of panelists. So A0A naman, kung may parang pinaka-reference product ka, similar to constant reference Duo Trio, yung application niya, no? So gagamitin mo siya kapag meron standard product where you would measure against yung whatever brand example or candidate new product mo. On the other hand, in difference testing, there is a similarity testing wherein ang goal mo is to not reject the null hypothesis. You could use a triangle Duo Trio and yung mga out of tests na yan to perceive no perceptible difference exists. Of course, you have to take into consideration yung sample size mo based on your selected alpha and beta levels. And some applications include substitution of ingredients without changing the overall sensory attributes of the product, and processing changes, as we have seen earlier, wherein inevitable na magbago yung process, pero ang initial na gusto mong mangyari is ma-retain yung overall quality and sensory attributes as the old process. Alright, so this is not to be confused with the ascending force choice test. This one is for comparing intensities, okay? Not on an ascending level, right? So, saan ba ginagamit yung alternative force choice test na to? So, for example, you used to show which two samples has more of the attribute under tested, or commonly known as the directional difference test. Alin ang mas maalat, alin ang mas matamis, or which two samples are preferred in the case of a force choice preference test. Choose one even if you actually dislike them both. Okay. Applications can be one or two-sided depending on kung alam mo na yung, syempre kung preference yan, pwedeng two-sided yan kung wala ka namang stake sa kung ano yung gusto mong i-prefer nila. Like you simply a market research firm and you want to know which of these two brands, competing brands, yung talagang mas gusto, pero wala ka namang connection dun sa either brand. Okay. You can usually use around 30 or more, or as few as 15 subjects. Alternative force choice for using more than two subjects, more than two samples. Okay. So, pwedeng pa rin siyang gamitin to that effect, like yun lang, nagbago ka lang ng mas marami yung samples mo, and could also be similar to 2AFC1 or two-sided depending on the objectives. You can also use simple ranking tests for 3 or more, but because of sensory fatigue, usually hindi recommended na more than 8 yung samples, okay? So, simple lang naman yung rank mo, 1 to how many yung samples, kung saan pwede siyang yung strength nga ng intensity or pwede rin preference ranking ito. Okay? So you can use it for either hedonic means, so effective means, or pwede rin siyang gamitin kapag halimbawa gusto mo lang i-test kung ano ba talaga yung pinakamaalat na maybe what French fries from the different fast food chains or something like that. Okay? So two samples of small or large difference in the attributes will show the same difference in rank, meaning to say dahil ordinal siya, as long as magkasunod sila ng rank, hindi mo kino-consider gaano kalayo yung actual difference, like in, let's say, saltiness. None. It doesn't discriminate between small or large differences in, let's say, saltiness if they're the same rank gap, first versus second, second versus third. Okay? So saan ba pwedeng gamitin pa ito? Pwede siya sa screening. Let's say nagpa-product dev ka and you have 5 prototypes, then you can use ranking. Okay, you can use this with fewer subjects than the other tests. So pag rating naman, of course, these involve the use of different scales, and you can use this simultaneously on multiple subjects. But again, because of the sensory fatigue, you must limit it to no more than 8. Kung gagamitin mo ito sa consumers, syempre mas konti pa doon kasi hindi sila sanay. Okay? And then you might want to use BIBD instead. If mas marami kang samples or kung consumers yung papatikimin mo, or konti nga lang yung samples pero sobrang dami naman ng questions na gusto mong iparate na sensory attributes. So sa dinami-dami ng descriptive test na pinag-aralan natin, bawat isa sa kanila ay may specific uses din naman, even if you think they're interchangeable and na parang yung iba mas okay kesa sa iba. So for flavor profile, you can use this when maraming samples and you only need a few highly trained panelists. Texture profile, on the other hand, similarly ganun din, pero sa texture mo naman siya gagamitin instead na sa flavor. QDA generally mas okay siya for quality assurance purposes, where you have the same kind of product day in and day out and you need well-trained personnel to know kung in ba yung product mo or hindi, no? Especially yung mga very sensitive products like maybe wines na talagang yung mga tasters nila gusto rin na ganito yung body, ganito yung intensity ng flavor, blah blah blah. Okay, but you can use this for other mass-produced things, no? But generally, you'd want a very high level of mass production to warrant paying a panel to taste samples every day. Okay, na full-time job nila yon. Pwede rin siya sa product development kapag na hindi naman kailangan yung reproducibility, pero kailangan mo pa rin, let's say, i-describe yung profile ng ginawa mong prototype, for example, and compare it maybe to the others, or see if that profile would fit yung market mo. Baka naman kasi masyadong experimental yung product, tapos pang niche market lang siya. Okay? Although sa Philippines wala rin masyadong gumagawa ng mga descriptive test kasi nga mahal mag-maintain ng panel. You need how many trained individuals being paid. So usually they just use a small group, or if you have a very large R&D team, then you can produce an interagency panel maybe. Okay, or inter-team panel. Free choice profiling for consumer testing when desirable na hindi gumamit ng common scale. Tapos mas madali rin kasi less training for the consumers. And as we have seen before, this would require some sort of multivariate technique to analyze. So for the spectrum method, you can use it for a variety of applications, like from the previous slide. But when reproducibility over time and place is needed, no? Kasi nga may standardization ka, especially sa mga ginagamit mong terms and references. Flash profiling for consumer testing. similar sa free choice profiling, wala ng common scale. And you only want the consumers to order the products by the intensity of attributes, and you don't want other more complex data. So in mapping, again, it's useful for consumer use as a descriptive test. And of course, as we have studied before, consumers place the products near each other depending on how they perceive them to be similar or different, and they describe the samples using descriptive and non-hedonic terms. So kung ganyan yung gusto mong gawin, again, of course, mas complex lang yung data analysis niya. Alright, similarly with sorting, ganun din. Yun nga lang, the subjects in this case may be asked to regroup samples according to set criteria. So less free siya than mapping, but maybe a bit easier again to analyze because you have criteria to start with. And for consumer tests, the very common hedonic rating is used when we want to study acceptance of a product from a certain population represented by our panelists or subjects. Fact food action rating scale is rarely used nowadays, but if you do want to use it, you'd want to use it for wanting to know how frequently some persons would like to eat their food, okay? The pair preference is when you want to compare two products, caveat of course, if it's forced choice, pwedeng pareho nilang ayaw. And rank preference if you're comparing 3 or more products such as halimbawa, preference ng mga blindly coded pancit canton from maybe the top 4 local and ASEAN manufacturers. Indomie pa rin ako, of course. Lucky Me is the second best, but all the others pwede na rin. Alright. So that concludes our last lecture. I hope you enjoyed and did learn a lot about sensory evaluation despite the remote circumstances. Mahirap kasi alam ko ang sensory, napaka-lab intensive niya. I've been handling the face-to-face labs for the past 80 years, I think. So alam ko na talagang pag wala yun, iba yung experience. And although your teachers are doing a good job naman sa pagturo ng remote lab, alam kong pagdating sa actual, of course there will be still some things na mas okay sa face-to-face, but I hope you did also learn integrate yung sa lab. Content-wise, alam ko medyo mabigat ito kahit ginawa na siyang 2 units. We had to review a lot of stat, which we will review again. We did assume that your high school stat would give you enough background para maging madali na lang. I also plan to revise yung approach sa stat for 131 since first time namin itong ginawa na iba na yung background ng stat or yung order ng stat subjects natin, pero it can be helped because sensory evaluation should really be taken early on and there's not enough room to fit your other majors in a better fashion. Anyway, yun, I hope you did learn a lot and konti na lang, push na natin to, patapos na yung SEM. I will not be burdening you with many requirements and I'll try to make the remaining part of the SEM as light as possible, but I also would not want to sacrifice yung pag-meet ng ating course outcomes. So I'm still trying to refine the least number of requirements to give you in the least amount of time it would take to do them, but would give you the most benefit in terms of seeing ano talaga yung natutunan at ma-apply ninyo for the future. Alright, so thank you and have a great day.